Chernobyl is considered the worst nuclear disaster in history. Not only did a recorded 54 people lose their life from the immediate blast, but the repercussions of the radiation exposure caused thousands to perish after the fact from developing cancer, and an estimated 3 million people to be displaced from the area as well. However, what's even more tragic is that if you look back throughout history, either man-made or natural in nature, there are countless others that rival the 1986 disaster. So get ready, because these are the top 10 disasters in history worse than Chernobyl. Starting us off in the number 10 spot is Deepwater Horizon oil spill. Beginning April 20th, 2010, the Gulf of Mexico was hit by the largest marine oil spill in history. This infamous oil spill, sometimes referred to as the Gulf of Mexico oil spill, all began with the Deepwater Horizon oil rig that was essentially a floating platform that was drilling an exploratory well about 18,000 feet deep. However, the disaster struck when the methane gas from the underwater well expanded, blasting through a recently installed concrete core and eventually rising into the drilling rig, where it ignited and exploded. The explosion quickly engulfed the drilling platform, taking the lives of 11 workers and forcing the remaining 94 to evacuate. And after just 2 days, the entire rig had sunk. From that point forward, with every passing moment, oil was seeping into the ocean, causing complete environmental devastation. And although BP, the oil company, had attempted to halt the leak with remote-controlled underwater vehicles, the oil continued to flow for another 87 days. It's estimated that about 210 million gallons of oil were leaked from the underwater well, affecting nearly 70,000 square miles of ocean. This disaster not only wreaked environmental havoc, but also resulted in major criminal lawsuits for higher-ups in the company. Next up at number 9, Huascarán Avalanche. What's scary about earthquakes is not only how much damage they themselves can do depending on the magnitude, but what else they can cause depending on where it happens. And what happens when an earthquake happens near the highest mountain in Peru? Unfortunately, the deadliest landslide in the country's history. On May 31st, 1970, a 7.9 magnitude earthquake emanated from about 35 kilometers from Mount Huascarán, tragically causing a massive landslide along the mountain. It's estimated that the avalanche sped down the mountain at about 160 kilometers an hour, picking up ice, rocks, and even a giant 700-ton boulder, along with other debris, eventually crashing down at the base of the mountain and burying the surrounding towns. The tragic day resulted in taking the lives of roughly 70,000 people and remains one of the worst disasters the country has faced. Coming in at number 8, Sichuan Earthquake. Back in 2008, the mountainous region of Sichuan province in southwestern China faced one of the worst earthquakes in history. Caused by the collision of the Indian, Australian, and Eurasian plates, a huge 7.9 magnitude earthquake erupted, completely destroying roughly 80% of buildings in the affected area. The magnitude was astronomical. Not only did houses, businesses, and schools crumble to the ground, but entire villages and towns were destroyed from the disaster. Plus, if the devastation from that weren't enough, the quake caused multiple landslides, which created about 830 makeshift dams across the region, coincidentally causing widespread flooding, which was then only exacerbated by heavy rainfall. According to the final government assessment, nearly 90,000 people were counted as either dead, missing, or presumed dead. On top of that, an estimated 375,000 were left with serious injuries. But even those who survived the disaster, with or without injury, were greatly affected, as millions of citizens were now homeless, without food, and many without family. Coming in at number 7, Mercury Poison. In 1908, the Shiso Corporation opened its doors in Minamata City, Japan. For years, they were a fertilizer company, however, they eventually expanded to include chemical production, eventually becoming the most advanced in the country both before and after World War II. In 1932, the Shiso factory started a satellite formaldehyde production, making 210 tons that year alone. And for over 30 years, between 1932 to 1968, the Shiso Corporation released their wastewater into the bay off Minamata City, not thinking anything of the environmental impact it could have on fisheries or their community. Now, I won't get into the chemistry too deep, but essentially a side reaction of creating this compound led to a very small percentage of methyl mercury, and this mercury was dumped into the bay along with the other wastewater, year after year after year. Over time, it infected the fish in the bay, which were then eaten by the public, and slowly but surely, the citizens of Minamata began contracting severe mercury poisoning. In 1956, the first victim of the disease was discovered, and after that, an epidemic of infection began. After all was said and done, there were roughly 3,000 certified victims of the poisoning, as well as another 10,000 who were compensated after several hefty lawsuits took place. So, although it may not have directly killed the most people, it caused an absolute pandemic, ruining the lives of thousands. Coming in at number 6, Mount Tambora eruption. Back in the year 1816, the world was faced with an incredibly strange occurrence. There was no summer. Countries all over the world, including tropical ones, were reporting incredibly low temperatures, and places like New York were facing snowstorms and frost in July. While at the time no one quite knew what happened, evidence has since suggested that it all had to do with an erupting volcano the year before. But of course, this was not just any earthquake. The legendary eruption occurred April 10th, 1815 at the Mount Tambora volcano in Indonesia, and remains the most powerful volcanic eruption in human history. According to NASA, 150 cubic kilometers of exploded rock flew into the air and would have been visible from about 1,300 kilometers away. But from this giant explosion came so much volcanic ash that it actually reduced the amount of sunlight that could reach the Earth's surface, and from there the temperature in the northern hemisphere dropped 1 degree Fahrenheit. Now, 1 degree might not sound like much, but it was enough to completely overhaul the climate for an entire year. Not only that, but the eruption itself caused roughly 11,000 deaths on site, followed by about 100,000 famine-related deaths for the following year due to crop shortages. Coming in at number 5, the Great Galveston Hurricane. Once upon a time, the small island of Galveston, just off the coast of Texas, was the grandest city in the entire state. It had the biggest port, the most wealth, swanky mansions, and even some of the first telephones and electric lights. However, after one fateful storm on September 8, 1900, the small island city would never be the same. The day began like any other, and although they had received limited news about a storm brewing near the Gulf of Mexico, they didn't think too much of it. Then around 11 a.m. they received a report that the storm was getting worse and the waters were very rough. But still, without the technology we have now, there was no way of knowing what was coming. Finally, around 3 p.m., 2 men ran into town from the beach shouting that the Gulf was looking like a 50-foot tall wall and something bad was headed straight for the island. Shortly after, the storm hit Galveston, the hurricane sweeping in at a whopping 225 kilometers an hour, paired with 6-foot waves crashing into buildings, sweeping away citizens, animals, and everything in sight. According to those who survived the fateful day, the storm went on for hours, not subsiding until the early hours of the next morning, just in time to see the wreckage in broad daylight. The carnage was insurmountable. Not only were roughly 3,600 houses and 600 businesses reduced to nothing but rubble, leaving thousands of citizens without shelter, but between 6,000 to 8,000 people perished during the disaster as well. Their bodies left mangled in the streets for their loved ones to try and identify. To this day, it remains the worst hurricane in US history. Coming in at number 4, the Indian Ocean tsunami. Almost 20 years ago, on December 26, 2004, a catastrophic magnitude 9.1 earthquake struck the undersea off the west coast of Sumatra, Indonesia. Now, as far as earthquakes go, that is almost as bad as it gets. In fact, since 1900, this event is considered the 3rd largest earthquake worldwide. From the time the quake began at 8 a.m. in Indonesia, there was only about 15 minutes before the speeding waves hit land, giving residents very little time to flee to higher ground and try and save themselves or their family. The deadly waves then continued for another 7 hours, devastating not only the nearby coastal areas, but even managed to reach as far as East Africa. Waves of up to 100 feet were crashing down, traveling as fast as 800 kilometers an hour and swallowing everything in its path. The final estimated death toll was 230,000. However, another 2 million people in 14 different South Asian countries, as well as some East African countries, were left completely displaced. To date, this tsunami has taken the lives of more people than any other recorded tsunami in history. Coming in at number 3, the Bhola Cyclone. On November 12, 1970, an unexpected and deadly storm struck what was at the time called East Pakistan, now known as the region of Bangladesh. The Bhola Cyclone formed over the Bay of Bengal from the remnants of Tropical Storm Nora. And Nora had spent 2 days over the South China Sea before beginning to intensify and move north towards East Pakistan. Before the storm arrived on land, the surrounding areas were inundated with flooding. Then on the day, the cyclone struck India and Bangladesh with wind speeds of around 185 kilometers an hour, absolutely decimating everything in its path. And tragically, either due to the lack of notice from the Indian Weather Service or not enough understanding of the cyclone's intensity, a proper evacuation plan was not put in place, and around 500,000 lives were lost to the disaster. However, as you can imagine, the issues didn't stop there. In the aftermath of the tragedy, there was a lot of back and forth and blame placed for not providing proper preparations, many criticizing the government's slow response to the aftermath. Then later that year, as a kind of revolt against the current government, a new opposition party ended up winning in general elections in East Pakistan, something that was completely ignored by West Pakistan. And ultimately, this led to the Bangladesh Liberation War in 1971 and the creation as an independent nation in 1972. Coming in at number 2, the Yellow River floods. The second largest river that runs through China is the Huanghe River, or the Yellow River, and there have been 3 major floods recorded that collectively are considered to be the worst floods in history, as well as some of the most destructive natural disasters ever recorded. The first happened in 1887, when the strategically placed dikes and dams filled with silt, gradually raising the water levels near the lowlands. Then, after a heavy rainfall, the river began to overflow and quickly resulted in the death of somewhere between 900,000 and 2 million citizens, as well as causing mass famine and homelessness across the surrounding areas. Then, several years later, in 1931, the river flooded again. This time, about 88,000 square kilometers of land became completely immersed in water, leaving 80 million people without their homes and killing an estimated 4 million. However, although the second is recorded as the worst flood, the most tragic was the last of these floods in 1938. Between 1937 to 1945, China and Japan were at war with each other in what is now referred to as the Sino-Japanese War. I won't get into all the nitty-gritty details, but essentially during this time, the Chinese were in a full-on resistance against the Japanese, who were attempting to advance their influence in the territory. And unlike the first two, the 1938 flood was intentional. Due to the advancements of the invading Japanese troops during the war, Chinese nationalists, under the force of their leader Chiang Kai-shek, destroyed the protective dams and dikes holding the river at bay, thus causing another catastrophic flood. The 1938 flood killed between 500,000 to 900,000 people, some of whom were soldiers, but many of which were their own civilians. Pretty much anyone that did survive was left as a refugee, their farmlands and homes destroyed by the flood, and resulted in an overall anger and distrust towards their government that took decades to heal. And last up today in our number 1 spot, the Bhopal Disaster. On December 3rd, 1984, the city of Bhopal, India was overrun by a catastrophic 45-ton gas leak from the Union Carbide insecticide plant. The leak began in the early hours of the morning, around midnight or so, and was only made worse when the public siren was shut off around 1:30 so as not to alarm the citizens over what, at the time, was believed to be an insignificant leak. To top it off, there was little to no communication between the plant, the Bhopal authorities, and the hospital workers, so no one was properly prepared when things got really bad. A mere hour and a half later, the public siren began wailing, this time for real, as it became evident that there was indeed a huge problem. Many were still asleep as it was around 3 in the morning, and so once the deadly gas reached the nearby towns, more than 3,000 citizens died instantly. instantly. However, the tragedy did not end there. The death toll continued to rise, climbing up to nearly 20,000 victims, and another 500,000 faced injuries such as respiratory failures and blindness. Even worse is that after the initial incident, the leak was reported not to have been dealt with properly, and so 300 metric tons of waste remained at the site for decades, contaminating drinking water and causing widespread chronic health problems, birth defects, and fertility issues for citizens until as recently as 2016. On a good note, as of 2004, the government is required to provide clean water to the residents due to the contamination in the groundwater, and in 2010, 7 former employees of the plant were convicted of negligence related to the incident. But nothing will ever change the fact that a gas leak was hidden from the public and killed thousands in their sleep. Well, there you have it. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to hit the subscribe button, and I'll see you next time.